So now I'm going to go back to this idea of an inner light and the metaphor of that we talked about the light bulb above the head, the dawn of awareness, enlightenment, illumination. And the tradition of an inner light in history is very ancient. And there was one point in time at which this metaphor ran much more deeply. And what I'm talking about here is, anybody heard of the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries? I have initiated a few people. We've got an initiate here. Good. The mysteries ran for thousands of years. It was historically, it was the longest trend in time that we know about. It ran from 1600 BC to about 400 AD. But we know very little about the actual details involved in it. They were open to all levels. In Greece, they were open to all levels of society. So men, women were allowed to enter this. If you were convicted of murder, you were not allowed to engage in these ceremonies. Anybody else could. Now, the interesting thing about the Eleusinian mysteries and these rites around the Mediterranean, and they're all devoted to different gods, goddesses mostly, Astarte, Aphrodite. They all involve, or seem to try to invoke some kind of inner light from people. This is what we get from some of the evidence, some of the testimony. And they were secretive. You could not talk about the actual rituals, but people were allowed to talk in general terms of what they drew from the experience. So you have in one book, one author says, mysteries were initiation rituals of a voluntary, personal, and secret character that aimed at a change of mind through experience of the sacred. And another author says, in the supreme moment of revelation, initiates simultaneously saw and heard some kind of supernatural luminosity. So it appears that some of these traditions at least involved, at least in part, an attempt to evoke this inner light within people. One writer, Hippolytus, says the purpose of encountering the light is to discover the sublime mysteries of nature. A Latin writer, Pullius, writes of his message from initiation into the mysteries of Isis. So this feeling of a light, this inner light, supernatural luminosity, often came with some kind of a message attached to it. And in his particular case, the message was, I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all the elements, primordial child of time, sovereign of all things, spiritual, queen of the dead, queen also of the immortals, the single manifestation of all the gods and goddesses that are known to you on earth. Now, what's really interesting about this one fragment, what one author said was, the soul at the point of death has the same experience as those who are being initiated into the mysteries. One is struck with a marvelous light. So I find it that telling that it seems like there's a direct line between this and the Buddhist teachings of the after-death experience, the white light of the void, this kind of thing, and contemporary near-death accounts, where you have the light, the beckoning light, the tunnel of light, this sort of thing. So I think this is not a metaphor. We're talking about something that runs much more deeply in human psyche and in human nature and human history. About 20, 30 years ago, there was 3 authors who attempted to decode this, what actually went on in this, and they tried to determine what was involved in the rituals. And these 3 authors, what they determined was there was evidence that they found that there was a drink given called kikion, and a beverage containing this fermented barley. And they believed that this contained a hallucinogenic compound, ergo of rot, which would act as a key to unlock this door. So these people were open more to our archetypal realms of experience. They think by introducing them then to this potion, that they were taken into these rituals, these ceremonies, and these priests and priestesses knew how to evoke this experience from them that was just latent. Now, Plato, as an educated Athenian, he would say, just one question, if you guys could just not talk because it's throwing me off. I'm trying to deliver this, I'm just here. Plato was an educated Athenian, so he would very likely at some point would have gone through the Eleusinian mysteries himself. And And he said the ultimate design of the mysteries was to lead us back to the principles from which we descended, a perfect enjoyment of intellectual brackets, spiritual good. Now, I find this really telling that Plato is talking about the mysteries because the most potent secular myth of Western philosophy is the parable of the cave. And I'm sure a few of you have heard this. If you've ever taken a philosophy course, you're probably familiar with the parable of the cave. It involves three prisoners who are chained to the floor of a cave, and behind them is a fire. On the cave walls projected shadows. So all they see, all they take to be the real world are the shadows in front of them. They don't know of the fire behind them. They don't know the nature of the trickery that's being played on them. And we can pretty much understand where he's getting at with this metaphor, with this parable. Here's a better illustration of it. This is from Plato's Republic. He describes a roadway where puppeteers are carrying these shapes along, and they cast these shadows, and the chained slaves, all they see is what he called the spectacle. All they see is this world of shadows, which they take to be the real world. Now, Plato had, just go back there a sec. Plato believed that, he compared the philosopher to somebody who escaped from the cave, turned around, saw the fire, and actually got outside the cave and saw the true source of all light, the sun. And then he goes back into the cave and tries to communicate to the other slaves what he's seen. And they have no understanding of what he's talking about, that they just can't put this together at all. So what Plato did was he was comparing the world of the judicial world, the academic world, our culture, to a world of shadows, where we only see, have a fragmentary vision of the true reality we're in. And when I'm talking about all of these experiences, these stories, this isn't just limited to, pagan cults or ancient peoples of one particular faith. You have, everybody's heard the story of St. Paul, Saul on the road to Damascus. He had this experience of a blinding flash of light. This was his conversion experience. So you have this experience of light which is filtered through the cultural consciousness of the time, of the person's particular cultural background. This is how they interpret the light that they see. St. Hildegard of Bingen, she was an abbess in the 12th century. And she writes, from my infancy up to the present time, I being now more than 70 years of age, I've always seen this light in my spirit and not with external eyes. It is more brilliant than the sun. I name it the cloud of living light. And when I look upon it, every sadness and pain vanishes from my memory. So she talked about this inner light which contained within it a comforting kind of communication and a reconnection to the world. And you hear this constantly in these references to the nature of this light. Giordano Bruno, who was a 16th century mystic, he said that the divine light is always in man, presenting itself to the senses and to the comprehension, but man rejects it. For his troubles, you can take this light stuff a little too far. The Vatican issued an edict and he was burned at the stake. Bruno also said that, believed that all the stars in space were occupied worlds, perhaps like ours. So this fellow is very, very ahead of his time. William Blake, we're going now from Christian and religious thinking into somewhat more of a secular interpretation of things. We're all familiar with this poem. Everybody's heard this. To see the world in a grain of sand, heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. We all know that. How many of us know the final words, the final stanzas of this? We are led to believe a lie when we see not through the eye, which is born in a night, to perish in a night, when the soul slept in beams of light. God appears God, and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. So he's making a poetic connection between the soul and its source within light. Now this is all very poetic and literary and nice and historical. Well, what's it got to do with people's real, present-day experiences? Well, coming up in the present now, this is Richard Buck, a medical doctor, Canadian, lived in Toronto, published a book in 1902. It's been in and out of print ever since, called Cosmic Consciousness. Richard Maurice Buck. I think this guy should be at least least as famous as Don Cherry as a Canadian, you know, somewhere between Don Cherry and Tommy Douglas, maybe. But Buck had an experience of his own involving this transformative light. And what happened with him was he was returning from a party, a dinner party, and he was speaking all night long with friends about philosophy, about ideas. And he was in a horse-drawn carriage returning home. And as he returned home, he thought the cab was on fire. He had the sense of this intense light which was consuming him. He was both inner and outer. And he says all at once, he's writing in the third person here because he put himself in the book as a character without identifying himself. He says all at once, without warning of any kind, he found himself wrapped around, as it were, by a flame-colored cloud. He knew that the light was within himself. Directly afterwards came upon him a sense of exaltation, of immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination quite impossible to describe. He saw and he knew that the cosmos is not dead matter, but a living presence. So this is a common kind of thing you read in these accounts, this sense, this light, inner light, comes with a reconnection to the world. And it kind of, at least at the time, it erases the person's sense of alienation from the world and the universe they live in. They sense they have some fundamental deep connection to it, and this light, this awakening, this dawn of awareness, this illumination, this enlightenment, this is where all these words come from, reconnects them back to this field of perception. Now, as I was working on this, I got talking to an elderly woman in her mid-80s, and she had, and I wasn't mentioning my talk, but she had talked about one of her stranger experiences she had had, and she lost her husband who died of a heart attack about 30 years ago. And she said, she was grieving, and this was about a week, 10 days afterwards. And she said she had a moment where all of a sudden she felt flooded with light. And she says it was, you know, the distinction between inner and outer collapses, it's so intense. You feel like you're made of light, you're observing this light, you are this light, you're part of it. And with this light came a message, which was, everything is going to be all right. You know, the world, for all its pains and sufferings, its tragedy, its joys, its pleasures, somehow it is what it's supposed to be. And when I talk about Buck, you know, this is conveying a viewpoint of our place in the world, which is much more positive and much more connected than the typical kind of scientific conception you have of human beings and the nature of the world. In the article I wrote on this, I said that if Buck was alive today, they'd probably drag him on the Jimmy Kimmel show, you know, and maybe pathologize his condition as perverse phototropic Pollyannaism, and give him a prescription to Despondex or some other affect-flattening drug, get him back on the straight and narrow. Right? We have trouble with the feelings of not just the idea of the supernatural or an inner light. We have trouble with the feeling of awe and joy combined. As a culture, it's threatening. It's too weird. Now, this is, I thought it was time for another cartoon. This is a news item a few years back. British Columbians are more open to unstructured mystical experiences than other Canadians, according to polls. And of course, we don't have kikion, we have caffeine. So we don't have consciousness expansion, we have nervous agitation. And this is how we function.